Welcome everybody to our fourth webinar of 2021. We're along a series that we've been doing these. I think this is probably our 78th or 79th in a row that we've done since we started last, pardon me, last March of 2020. So we've been bringing in some great people and talking about some pretty cool things, and this is no exception. This is a pretty interesting topic here, and just a window into a lot of the stuff that John, our guest John, that we'll introduce in just a second, does for folks and with his engineering background and in many different forms of motorsports. So I think everybody's going to really enjoy this. So let's chat about. Let me bring up a little bit of an introduction slide for John, and kind of a cool array of pictures there that shows the great variance of what the type of motorsports that John has been involved in. This is John's third webinar so far with us, and I appreciate it a lot. There's a lot of hard work that goes into putting these things together, and so we really appreciate it. And Robbie might put some links up into the chat box, and they'll be in the description below if you're watching this later on YouTube, of his first couple of webinars that he did with us, so you can review back and take a look at those later if you wish as well. So with that, John, tell us a little bit about you. Welcome, by the way, number one. Thank you again for doing this, and tell us a little bit about your background in motorsports. I read right there, 50 years as a driver, designer, fabricator, engineer, long list of things, including webinar instructor. So maybe I can update my resume as well and put webinar instructor on there as well, right? So give us a little bit of a background on what you've been doing for the last 50 years.
Okay, well, first let me say thank you for inviting me. This is an opportunity that I really enjoy getting to do. Okay, we could spend the whole hour talking about my escapades and war stories. And there's probably something in there about rules that I had nothing to do with. I know nothing about radar guns, tape, serrated wickers. I don't know nothing about that. But there are a lot of things that never really did quite make it into the rules that, you should never let an engineer have a machine shop, because you just never know what kinds of little bitty goodies come out of there. Anyway, all right.
Lots of good stories there behind the scenes,
Yeah,
right, where you
yeah.
may or may not have gotten noticed by the sanctioning
This
bodies.
is the sheriff here. It's like, okay, we're good. Okay, well, this infection or addiction started in 1970, so I guess we're working on 51 years. But you know how it is. I wasn't born into racing. I had to work my way up. So in 1970, I bought my first race car, forged my parents' signature on an insurance waiver, and started racing at the local racetrack. And at that point, it's gone from infection to addiction. So anyway, when I first started out there, for another 3 years, I built and drove my own cars. But being a college student, some things have to give. So I had to give up my driving. But when I finished college, I became an engineer and, was the old engineer by day, shop owner by night, and, did nights and weekends working on other people's cars. It was kind of cool when you in school and you go, oh, so that's how much force it takes to shear a rivet, or, oh, that's why my welds are breaking. So it was kind of fun to bring that in there.
The engineering in you is coming out into your motorsports career, right?
Yes.
Yeah, perfect.
But, after a number of years, I got burned out with the corporate world, and I really liked what I did at nights and weekends better. So in '84, I got a job in a shop building cars. And then the next year, I got my first break into the big time and, got on with the Gallus IndyCar team. And it was kind of a short-lived experience, but it lasted long enough that we got our car on the pole at the Indy 500 that year. And it's
Not a bad
amazing.
accomplishment. Not a bad accomplishment. Yeah.
It's amazing what that does for your resume. It's like, yeah, I put a car in the pole at Indy.
Yeah. Yeah.
What about it?
Let's talk. Huh?
Yeah. So, but that was nice because it did open up a lot of doors. And after that, I worked with Nigel Stroud for a couple of years. We did a lot of things. I was really the kind of a suspension specialist in those days. And we did the Mazda, I think the number was a 767. It was a Group C car, whatever. But, a lot of miscellaneous things here and there, half of an F1 car. I don't know who got to design the other half. But it all kind of started me into my career of actually making a living from racing. It was one of those things where at the time, I hated, the 5 white shirts and, ties every day. And I loved racing. So it was just kind of such a natural fit. But from that, my company Auto-Ware was developed. I was developing my own software and, selling for other people. I was kind of a distributor. And so I was doing that and had to supplement that a little bit with, engineering on the side. So I was designing a lot of short track suspensions and, had one customer that had a Trans Am car. And so I was kind of getting my feet wet everywhere. Well, that all was going along nicely. And then in 99, I ended up the team engineer for the CLR team. And for the next 6 years, I was the team engineer, kind of, director of competition, if you will. And that's where things went off the deep end. At that point, I had a data system. Now remember, this was 99. We had a data system. We had 3 infrared tire temp sensors all the way around. We had all your standard issue, accelerometers, so we had 3-axis G. We also had yaw. We even had a strain gauge in our drive shaft yoke on the back of the transmission. So in essence, we had our own built-in dyno, and we had a number of pressure taps. So we were doing aero work at the same time, which was nice. That dovetailed really nicely because at that point I was also getting to work in the wind tunnel. So, it really went off the deep end back in those days.
Wow. A lot of technology.
Yeah. But it worked out nicely. That team finally kind of ran its distance on the funds that were available. And after that, I did 2 years with the Guthrie Indy Lights team. And it was nice because I've always loved open wheel. I guess maybe being from Albuquerque and, that relationship, open wheel kind of always, I did start in open wheel modified. So, I mean, that might have had a little something to do with it.
There's a big family from the Albuquerque area, right?
There's some people we don't have. I guess they race. There's some people from here. Yeah. Anyway, from that point on, I was just kind of had my choice of writing my own ticket. And so, I was consultant for a number of years. I did a number of FSAE teams, Trans Am, like I said, most of the SECA alphabet, Formula V, F, Continentals, Enterprise, then you get into the prods, E-Prod, F-Prod, it just kind of goes crazy. And then along about 15, I did a stint in the Road to Indy. And I have to admit that of everything I've ever done, I think the 2-liter cars over in the Road to Indy is the most competitive thing I've ever done. They're extremely well policed. I had to really come up, outside the box to get some advantages there, but it was just kind of a nice way to kind of round out my roads on the day. And in I think it was 17 or 18, I said, okay, I'm getting a little too old to be going over the pit wall, so I need to retire from the road and just stay home. So And as they say, enough about me. Let's get to some data.
What's pretty cool is not only did you retire from that a little bit, my guess is you probably end up at the track every once in a while, right? But started a little machine shop there at home and doing data webinars that are not just talking about the data. We'll talk more about these towards the end, but not just data webinars about about data, but also about engineering, which how to use the data a little bit more than just which buttons. What does that button do? How to do this function, but how to actually use it, which is exactly where this presentation is about to go. We're going to talk about how to be better at brakes, right? And being better at brakes with data, where John's going to share not just how to build a math formula and how to do it, but give you hopefully open up your eyes, everybody's eyes, to just, hey, think about what you want to take a look at, and let's walk through the steps of building a process of being able to see that, and then how to read the data from the motorsport side, from the engineering side, and from the driver side. So looking forward to the rest of this one because of your background and what you do, and so I think we're gonna have a good time. So perfect. Let's go ahead and
Okay.
get started.
Well, since we're talking about brakes, this is where the old lawyer's caveat semper disclaimer needs to come in here. AIM Sports, Auto-Ware, and their respective employees disclaim any and all liability from the use of the content provided herein. Basically, racing is dangerous. Use this information at your own risk. Honest. I have lost friends. I have been 100 feet away and run up to the car and looked in and had that.
Yeah.
Honest. This is dangerous. It will kill you if you give it even the slightest chance. Please be careful. All right. With that, let's talk about the power of data and the old, what if?
There you go.
You know, I like to use my data system and do more than just look at the recorded channels. I like to be proactive, kind of preemptive, and think outside the box. I've had a lot of crazy ideas, and not just easy things like a coasting math channel or a wide open throttle integral, but, tricky stuff like predicting brake lockup before it actually happened, or doing a better job at adjusting brake bias, so I can get better braking. So with that, have the old engineer come out. I know this is the part where my wife says, I asked what time it was, not how to build an atomic clock. Sorry, guys, you got an engineer. It goes with the territory. All right, number one fundamental of racing. My friend Peter's money line. Basically, this is our speed plot. This is, just basically distance around the track on the X and your speed on the Y. We have a positive slope up and to the right. This is accelerating. And we have a negative slope that goes down. That's slowing or decelerating. Now, from an engineering standpoint, I have this plot and I figure out, how do I make a faster lap time? I mean, that's what I'm always chasing, a lower lap time. And engineers always like to look at the plot area and say, well, hey, if I have more area below the line, you always hear engineers talk about area under the curve. We're interested in the area below the line, not above the line. Now, if I could magically have my speed go all the way across the top of the plot, then that is the absolute fastest you can go. That's the lowest lap time you can have. However, in reality, we have to slow down for corners. So we have these positive slopes and negative slopes. A lot of attention has been given to the positive side, um, thinking about motors, gears, reducing drag, that sort of thing. But today, we're going to focus on the negative slope and how to get more area over here. Now, all cars are different. Don't try and find the magic bullet. We have to kind of take each example as we go down the road. You may have a bigger, heavier car, or maybe you have an old uh, vintage car, and they may not have that physical braking capability, and you may have less slope. Or you may be a little more timid, and maybe you brake a little longer and not quite so hard and end up with less slope. But the idea is that I want to try and do something to work on this area of the line. Now, I've been saying slope, and we think about flatness, steepness. We need to be careful with aspect ratio. If I were to catch the bottom of my little plot here and scoot it way up, well, then this line is going to kind of flatten out. And if I pull that further down to the bottom of the screen, well, it's going to get steeper. So don't get wrapped around the axle about the actual slope that you see. This is just the picture. But the idea is that we want to try and work on improving that angle. Now, this doesn't necessarily talk about where you brake in the zone or where a brake zone is. And we're just going to try and focus on how to get a little more angle in that line. Now, one way to get more area under that line is to change your brake zone. Brake later and harder. Now I like to use this example because this is one of the old original Ford GTs. It was salvaged and brought back to life so it could race in vintage. This guy is a car guy. He owns a pretty big chain of body shops here, and he's up on the wheel, but he's not an engineer, and he kind of pieced together his brake system. He went online, found these rotors, those calipers, this pedal assembly, and pieced it all together. And the thing is that you can see that it takes almost as much time to slow it down as it did to speed it up. Well, he is, an aggressive kind of guy, so he made a thing to go in his shoe, so he could push harder. And he could go in deeper and, have more area under the curve here. We see we add this area over here, and it did improve his lap time by 3 seconds. So, braking later and harder is one way to capture more area under the curve. On the other hand, let's say that you've got a smaller, lighter car, or car with massive brakes, really well designed, and you can have a really steep negative slope on your braking area. So that kind of leads us to the old question, well, is more braking possible, or am I exceeding the capability of the brakes, or I should say the tires, and locking them up? I need to thank Ross Bentley for allowing me to borrow this picture from his website, for educational purposes, to try and illustrate, that you can use too much brakes and get the old dreaded flat spots.
There are limits in even the best of race cars, right? So.
Yes. So, meanwhile, back here at our data, we need to tell, is more braking possible or not? So, when I look back here at my speed line, I want to know, is more braking possible? Well, if you have brake pressure sensors, the answer is yes. I can go back to my old what if and think about some new things. What if I were to think about how much clamping force does it take on my rotor? My rotor's spinning around here. How much clamping force does it actually take to lock up the wheels? It's like, let's start thinking outside the box. Now it works best if we have front and rear brake sensors. If you only have a front brake sensor, you can still get kind of a good idea here, but it really works best if you use both sensors. Now, traditionally, what I see are people, you know, looking at plots like this and say, okay, if I push on the brake pedal and I'm looking at my live readings, and if I can get 400 pounds at the front, I need to have my rear set at 325. Or if I can press on the pedal and I can see 600 pounds on the front, well, I need to dial it so that my rears are at 4 1/4, whatever that number happens to be. That's the way I see a lot of people using brake sensors. But I like to kind of really get outside the box and start thinking about, what if I were to think about that clamping pressure and really start thinking outside of the box. Now, I don't need to be doing, crazy stuff. And I'm not trying to hit the moon 239,000 miles away where, if I'm shooting here from the ground and I'm off, geez, even, a fraction of a second of a degree, I'm going to totally miss the moon. What I'm doing here is I want to get 90% of an answer, 95% of an answer, where before I had no answer. My competition has no answer. Well, if I can find 3/10 of a second easily, or maybe even a tenth of a second in one break zone, I'm a happy camper, because all those might add up to half a second, couple seconds in a lap time, where before we had no way of knowing we could get there. Well, here's the old engineer again. Sorry, folks. In order to make that work, I need to have some simplifying assumptions. First assumption is flat Earth. I'm not going uphill. I'm not going to be going downhill. I'm going to ignore all the bumps. I'm going to ignore the environment. I'm assuming that it's not raining, that it's not snowing. Those things are removed. I'm also going to assume that my tires have a constant coefficient of friction. Now, we all know that hot tires have a more bite, a different coefficient than cold tires, and new tires are better than worn tires. And, old tracks that are polished off versus new, we know there's all those things that impact the coefficient, but we're just going to assume that it's constant for now. Also, we're going to assume that brake pads have a constant coefficient of friction. Now, we know that pads have hot bite, cold bite, and that coefficient changes. And there's also even a speed effect in there. If you were to look at a plot, it does some strange thing. But for now, just to get our 90% answer, we're going to assume that it's constant. Another thing we need to assume is that all of that pressure in our brake lines, that our sensors are reading, all of that actually gets transmitted to clamping force on the rotor. That we don't have a piston cocked in the caliper somewhere, or there's some drag or some interference, so that all of that force actually gets to squeeze on the rotor. Another simplifying assumption is that there's no weight change, no distribution change in our weight. In essence, my oil isn't going to run up in the side of the sump, and the fuel isn't going to all pack up on one end of the fuel cell. And there's no changing of our weight distribution. Another thing we need to ignore is the second law of thermodynamics. Now,
we all know all of the laws of thermodynamics.
Oh, absolutely. And we've probably experienced that second law of thermodynamics with brake fade. For what we're going to be doing today, we're going to assume that all kinetic energy can be converted to thermal energy. In other words, no brake fade. Now, if you are so inclined and want to get into the stuff that we do in my pro classes, we do address the second law of thermodynamics. But for today, we're trying to make it easy. And just to kind of wrap it up here, we're going to say there's no engine braking. I didn't run down the end of the straightaway, hit the clutch, drop it 3 gears, and dump the clutch. The old dreaded wheel hop or brake hop for some people's terminology. We're going to just kind of try and keep these easy.
So you're simplifying assumptions. It really just comes down to, yeah, you are you 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 are making sure everybody understands that, yeah, this is not going to be a perfect answer, but it's going to get us so much farther down the road where we can begin to use this data without having to do that last 10%, which takes 90% of the time, right, to get all of this stuff right. So you are just making sure everybody understands that this is a
This
wild
is
ass guess, kind of
yeah, it's an approximation.
your swag, as you've
Yes.
mentioned in previous webinars, right? So
Yep. Good old
perfect.
swag. SWAG. Scientific wild ass guess.
Yeah. But very
Well,
valuable.
yeah, very valuable. Now it's, um, you know, the old engineer kind of thing. We have to realize that we know that there's some things that aren't getting us, but we're going to do some work and we're going to get 90% of the answer.
And we'll talk
Because
about it as we start to talk about the actual math channels and some of the data that we're going to look at from them. Is it gives you as an operator, as a data guy, or as a driver or team owner, whatever your role is to look at the data when you first get it, and then, okay, well, maybe some of these assumptions were a little bit bigger or smaller than we thought, and maybe we can adjust them a little bit, and you learn from the data that you get to make even better, to take that 90% and make it 95% based on just experience. So with that type of car and such. So, yeah, looking forward to it.
yeah, well, the one thing, being a team engineer, you also kind of get tasked not with just, numbers, but also kind of a little bit of management. And the thing is, what is our most precious resource?
Yeah.
I mean, our single most precious resource is lap time. How much time do you get to spend on the track? Um, so if I can do a little work here ahead of time and I can get 90% of the answer, well, then I'm going to make better use of my track time. Because the old engineering joke is, well, it takes 90% of the work to get 90% of the answer. And then it takes another 90% of work to get the rest of the answer.
When we had Jorge Seegers on, he talked a lot about exactly what you just pointed at, which is, boy, preparation, getting ahead of the game, getting some things in place where you can do so much more with the data that comes off the car, during for the on-track sessions. It is such an important thing. Preparation is really is the path to success.
Yes, it is. So let's kind of keep moving. Otherwise, you'll learn more about the atomic clock
And how it works.
and how it
Yeah.
works and why it works. All right. We're going to start this process by going to our math channel window, and hopefully everybody knows that you go to the little equation up on the menu ribbon there, and that'll bring up the math channel window. And what we're going to be doing here is we're going to be talking about the constants. We have the text box over here where the big arrow is, and this is where we're going to input some constants. You can see I've got one here, wheelbase, and that's where we give it the name and then the value. And what we want to do is put in a bunch of constants here, kind of based from our simplifying assumptions. So, don't let this slide scare you. Trust me, when we get to the bottom of this slide, you're going to go, oh, that was no big deal. And we're going to keep moving right through here. This is as scary as it gets. All right, so let's talk about some of the the math constants. Here are our typical, what we'd call them in English. And a lot of times I would do a shorthand over in the actual math channel window where I put in the constant just to make it a little easier. So we need to start out with our total vehicle weight. In other words, the cars on the scales, add up all four, input that number in pounds. Now we're going to use empirical, we're not going to use metric, we're going to use imperial units. There, got that. Likewise, since you had the car on the scales, you need to know the weight on the front end. What was the total of the two front scales? Just enter that in this constant variable name in pounds. Likewise with the rear axle weight, and then your wheelbase, and we're going to do that in inches. Now, we're entering a lot of things. You think, oh my gosh, there's a lot of numbers. But remember, you're probably only going to have to do most of this one time. Hopefully, you don't change wheelbase. Usually a change in wheelbase has something to do with a very hard object like a concrete barrier, and we don't want to get into there.
Changing of
So,
your wheelbase.
yeah.
We did have a question here real quick, and I think you already touched on it, very briefly, that you were going to use SI units instead of metric units. The question is, can I change the units to metric with other constants you have in the equals? I'm sorry, in the formulas. The answer to that probably is yes, but the rest of the equation that we're going to show you on the next slide would need to be changed in order to use those. You're using some things that are expecting these units to be in the units you've mentioned. So if somebody wants to tackle that and be able to use metric values, we can do that. Or the other thing on the math channels is we do have some functionality in the AIM Race Studio software where you can, the value is coming in, let's say as as pounds, and we can change the pounds to kilograms and things, and use some additional constants to turn that stuff around. So doable, but there'll be a little extra work. What we're going to talk about today is using these units here.
Yeah, and that's a very good question because we need to match all of our units. If the units I'm getting from a sensor is PSI, well, I need to realize that, okay, I'm in imperial, I'm not in bar or kilopascals or whatever. So that's why these are all set up the way they are, is because this is the way I use my my channels on the system. Okay, just kind of zipping on down here. Center of gravity height. A lot of people know how to do this exercise. If you don't, there's a lot of places on the web where you can put your car in a set of scales and do a quick little exercise, and it will calculate the center of gravity height for you.
I was goofing around on some different websites as I was getting up to speed on some of the stuff we're going to talk about today, and I happened to find this Auto-Ware website of it happens to be yours, right, John? And you have a page, a direct page where you have 5 or 6 calculators that are just stuff that you do that people need to do. One of them being a calculator for calculating your center gravity height and get into directions on what to do next, and plug in those numbers, do this, plug that number in. Robbie down there in the chat box just put a link directly to that calculator. For those of you watching this later on YouTube, I'll put that down into the description. So all of us hear about center gravity. Maybe we have made some swag, some wild ass guesses at what those numbers are in the past, but there's a nice little calculator for us all to do.
Thanks. Okay, well, let's keep moving here. We need to know on our tires what's called the rolling radius. That's kind of a standard engineering expression. And you can take a tire and measure the circumference and divide by pi, whatever, and get the radius. Or if you've got a gizmo that'll measure that for you, that's nice. But it's not what's called the rolling radius. We need to know that is basically from the flat spot on the bottom of the tire back up to your spin axis, in essence, your axle line or your spindle. Usually you can just use a tape measure and go over and get that close enough. You don't need to be out there with a micrometer. Remember, we have a lot of simplifying assumptions. So if a number is off a teeny little bit, yeah, we're going to miss the moon, but I can still find that 1/10 of a second over there in the break zone. Okay, and those values are in inches. The next number that we need to plug in as a constant is the tire coefficient of friction. There's a lot of bench racing about, what that number is, and you might see something in a magazine or whatever. But when I start out, I like to use 1.1. That's a very conservative number. A decent DOT tire on a decent surface can get a 1.1. Super good racing tires, I think probably the best I've ever seen is about a 1.8. Now, those are super duper high-end racing tires that you don't buy, you only lease. That was kind of an odd thing I discovered when I got up far enough in the ranks. Um, Firestone wouldn't sell us the tires. We leased the tires, and even if we destroyed it in a wreck, we had to give them back the carcass and everything. So those
Before you
guys
leave
were
the track. Yeah, before you leave the track.
exactly.
Yeah, you know.
Oh, all right. 10-second war story. Um, we got in big trouble with Firestone um, because we were involved in a crash at Homestead. And this was really before they kind of started getting onto tethers. And we had a whole wheel, tire, upright, the whole thing, you know, leave the park, went over the fence. And apparently somebody out there was up for a souvenir because they got it before we could find it.
Oops.
And oh man, were we in trouble. We had to file all kinds of paperwork. It's like, you know, honest, honest, we didn't give it to the other company. Anyway,
We wish it was that easy, right?
yeah.
It's costing us a lot more than that.
But just keep in mind a range of 1.1 to 1.4 is probably reasonable. And we'll talk a little bit more about how to adjust that number in. All right. Moving down to our brake rotor radius. An easy thing to do is just go ahead and take the diameter and split it, you know, for the radius. Now, being an engineer, you know, I should be a little more exact and say, okay, where is the centroid of the swept area, and you know, calculate that. But I usually just come in from the edge of the rotor, you know, maybe a quarter of an inch or something. That way I know I'm actually into the pad. The most important thing is just be consistent with all of these constants. If you go to the edge, then always go to the edge. If you go to the center of the swept area, always go to the center of the swept area.
Do it front and
Remember,
rear the same. That's really
yes,
as much the
that's the
important part.
important thing, is just be consistent. Because
Joe has a question in the Q&A box here that kind of ties into this area. He's running a class that still has drum brakes in Formula V. The rotor radius, I think that's a fairly easy number then to get to, but the piston numbers that
okay,
have a different way of using their brakes. So how do you think? What do you think about that?
okay, thanks for bringing that up. That reminds me that I forgot to mention something. One of our simplifying assumptions is we're using disc brakes.
Right.
Drum brakes are a little different animal. You know, a lot of, now not all drum brakes, but a lot of drum brakes were self-energizing. You know, you had a primary shoe and a secondary shoe. In other words, a leading and a trailing. And your old wheel cylinder in those days, you know, the wheel cylinder pushed out on both shoes, but you had your primary and your secondary. So the one shoe rolled up against the stop, and they were kind of what they were called self-energizing, and that kind of added a little more to it. So this, what we're doing today is not for drum brakes. I'm sorry. That takes a lot of different math and a few other simplifying
Joe
assumptions.
mentions that it's the old Volkswagen brakes, and the Formula V is not self-energizing, so it's just two pads going out through a wheel cylinder, right? So does that still hold true with what you just said? It's really, you shouldn't probably use this process for his.
You could. They're still a little self-energizing, you know, because you are pivoting on the one end or the other end. So
Exactly.
they are to a certain degree, but we go back to the old what if. You know, this whole thing came back to what if I could figure out what the lockup was. All right, well, we're doing the math and everything for disc brakes, but you could think this through and come up with the same answer for drum brakes.
Adjust the formula just a little bit,
Mm-hmm.
and then some of the
Yeah,
different constants would probably get there. So, okay,
yeah.
perfect.
So the main thing is, you know, we've introduced this whole idea of, hey, there's another way I can use my data system. And in the end, we're even going to save you the typing. So all you have to do is plug it in. But every once in a while, somebody has to do a little work. All right. So brake pad coefficient. You You know, we said before that our simplifying assumption was that we're just going to use a single number. That number will float. And just to give you a range of ideas, you know, if you go down to the local auto parts store and get some just nasty old lifetime guarantee, rock hard, squeal like hell pads, you know, you may find you have a coefficient of down around 0.25. Maybe it was a little better, maybe it was 0.27. Really good, high end, you know, nice. Maybe even under the carbon these days, you can expect to see maybe a 0.48. Maybe you've got some super duper new things now. Maybe you're getting a little higher than that. Maybe you can do that. But realistically, what most of us have access to, you're probably going to be somewhere 0.3 to 0.4. So just kind of keep that in mind when you're plugging these numbers in. However, if you ever noticed on the edge of a brake pad, you take a brake pad and turn on its edge, usually there's a little code. You can take that code and go back to the manufacturer's website, and a lot of times they will have an effective coefficient that you can use. All right, keep moving down here. Let's go down to, you know, our piston diameter. You know, basically that's just the diameter of the piston in the caliper. If you have, you know, a leading trailing kind of thing where you have a smaller and a bigger one, just take the average. It's going to be close enough for what we're doing. Sure, we could expand the math and include that, but we're just trying to get that answer quickly. So just take the average if you've got different. And then we want to input the number of pistons. Now, we have two kind of basic systems when it comes to disc brakes. We have floating calipers and we have floating rotors. Some calipers will have pistons on both sides of the rotor. Some calipers only have pistons on one side of the rotor. So to make this a lot easier, if you were to take the brake rotor and just look at the side, like when it's mounted on the car, how many pots can you see? It's like, oh, I see one great big pot, or, oh, I see there was two pots. That's what you want to input here for number of pistons. Pretty straight up. Now, we spent a lot of time going over all these constants. Just want to make sure that everybody understood where all this magic was coming from. And you're not going to be changing this number very often. Most of these things will stay constant from now on. Now, you may tweak a few things, or tire coefficient or something, but otherwise, you do these things once, and then you're done with it. So let's go to the next thing. This is where the magic happens. Here is our estimated theoretical max front brake pressure math channel. Now we've got some colors here to help make it a little easier. All of these blue things, all of these constant variable names are the ones that you entered over here in the math channel constants text box, if I said that properly.
And enter what we just chatted about on the prior screen, right? So even if you grab those math channels that we have linked into the chat box, you end up with you can bring those in, type them in, whatever it is. You're still going to have to go into this constants area, create a new one for pad, the front pad, coefficient of friction, and put it in there. And then when you run this math channel, then it's going to use all of those constants. So.
Yep. So this is the magic up here. This math channel is the magic that makes this idea work. Now we've got the blue came out of your constants. The red are from actual sensors, and that will come over here in your identifiers. Now your identifiers might also include other previously calculated math channels. We have those as green. So if you ever see a math channel that I or a lot of the other people do that have a green in there, it's just a reminder to make sure when you look over here in your math channel text box that a previously calculated math channel is above the math channel that you were just creating. Otherwise, it never worked.
Yeah, not something we have in this particular instance, but very important part of AIM Sports math channels.
Mm-hmm.
There's a question over in the chat box. I thought maybe it'd be great to ask you real quickly, because maybe other people will be confused on this as well. Wouldn't brake master cylinder size affect this? The answer is, since it's being, well, I'll let you answer it.
That's a very good question. Now, it does affect how the car stops, and the master cylinder size does affect the line pressure, but we are measuring the line pressure.
There you go.
So the in essence, everything upstream from the sensor is kind of removed from the equation because we got there. Now, this is kind of a good little war story here. This all comes from the old days when I used to have to figure out, okay, if I put you, driver, on a Nautilus type machine, how hard can you push? And I go, okay, he can push that hard. And then I go back and do my math on my pedal and my pedal ratio and my master cylinders to get to line pressure. So this is kind of an outgrowth of what I used to have to do in the old days.
Exactly.
Hey, life is easy with data.
Yeah, much easier now.
Yep. So sure, this is kind of a ugly looking equation, and sure, I could have cleaned a lot of things up and got rid of multiple constants over here, but personally, I like to leave kind of the evolution of my math channel, because if I run into a problem, it's a lot easier to come back and debug. Now, we don't need to talk about all the math, just it works. Use it as at your own peril. Remember, I was never there. But the idea is I have this math channel, and now I can plot it just like any of my other measures. And I want to do that with an XY plot. So once I have my math channel created, it shows up over here with my other measures. And I'm going to plot it on my XY plot. So what I've got here is the value of my new math channel on the Y and longitudinal G on the X. Remember, you have to select both channels in an XY plot. Now, the main thing that we want to look at here is the slope. This is the part that really is what we're concerned with. Now, if by chance yours is flipped around, it's mirror image and it's going the other direction, chances are you are using a different channel down here. Now let me go back one. I should have mentioned this, sorry. This is from an actual sensor. Now your system may be set up to where this has a different name. Maybe it's long space ACC or longitudinal G. It may have a different name, but that's what we're going after. Now the math channel you have here, we tweaked a little bit, so it's kind of using the standard SAE convention where acceleration is positive and deceleration, in other words, slowing, is negative. Personally, I always like to flip it around on my setups. So if you have it flipped around the way I do, then you can eliminate that parentheses, the times, and the -1. In other words, to get it back to the inverse. But if you just keep it the way it is here, then it'll work nicely. But on this next slide, you may have a mirror image and you may want to put long G inverse here. Now, to me, I'm kind of a strange guy. I'm always moving to the right. So, that's why I always set mine up that way. It doesn't matter. You can have yours going the other way. It works just the same. The main thing is we wanted to find out this portion of the line. In other words, that's my threshold that I want to think about.
Theoretical, calculated, how much brake pressure can you apply for the certain amount of G's.
Right. This is my theoretical max front pressure. We're going to ignore all this other stuff here. This is kind of what we call the noise. If it bothers you and you want to clean that up a little bit, come back in the math channel and adjust this number right here. Maybe make it 1.5, maybe 2. You're starting to push in the envelope at 2. But this just kind of cleans up the math channel so that it's really working under braking and not just going down the straightaway.
I think
when
you
you've
made
got
a
lot
little
of
bit of a slip there. I
vibration.
just want to make sure for people that are watching this later. Go back to that other slide. You said 1.1.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm
I just
sorry.
want to make sure it's 0.15 or
Yes.
0.2.
Yeah.
I don't want
Yes.
people to
I'm
plug
sorry.
in a big number and it doesn't work at all, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Sorry. Sorry.
okay, no problem. No
It
problem.
wouldn't even show up on the screen.
Exactly. So I don't want people
All right.
to fight that.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Sorry.
go ahead.
Sorry. My bad.
That's okay.
0.1, 0.15. Okay.
Perfect.
But all the rest of the stuff, make sure you follow everything. Put the leading 0. We should have mentioned that. But anyway,
Yeah, it's all built
if you,
into the
it's
math
all
channels
built
we've
in.
shared as well.
We've tried to clean it up as much as possible. Otherwise, it would be hard to find this portion of the line. It would be scribbles all over the place. So it should turn on this math channel when you're braking and then turn it off when you've stopped braking. Okay, so that's how you get this line. If this line looks really crazy, go back and look at your constant that you entered. Might have a mistake somewhere, but this is what you want it to look like. All right, now we're going to get to the fun part. Ooh, we spent a long time doing all of our homework, but we're finally at the track and I get to use this math channel in practice and I'm going to say, oh,
Some data.
cool, look at this.
Throw some data at it. Yep.
All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to add on this XY plot. I'd already selected my theoretical pressure. Well, I'm going to add my front brake pressure.
Actual front brake pressure in
My
red.
actual line pressure. Now make sure that you are using PSI, that you don't have this set at bar or some other unit. Because what I want to do is I want to see what is my actual line pressure in relation to that theoretical lockup pressure. Oh, hey, this is cool. Now I can see how close am I to actually locking up my tires. Now, you may need to troubleshoot this. Engineering tends to be an iterative process. And I always start, like I said, with my tire coefficient of friction at 1.1. Sometimes I'll start it at 1. Because what I want to do is I want to see that my line pressure went above my theoretical pressure. Then I know I can start kind of increasing my tire coefficient to what I'm probably experiencing on the track. I can work with the driver or myself. I can say, okay, I just started to feel a little spool down. I'm getting a lockup. Come back and look at here. Adjust that tire coefficient or maybe adjust your brake pad coefficient. Either of those two will move your theoretical up or down on the plot. So it's kind of a process where you have to back in a little bit. But once you've got that number, keep using it. You're good. Now, this is not without some hazards. An important thing to do is make sure that everything is being plotted consistently. I say this because I've been burned.
Haven't we all?
Notice I've got the little box checked next to both of my channels. That way I can see that this one has a peak value of 700 and this one has a peak value of 700. If I had one of them plotted at, let's say, 1,500 pounds, it's going to be, twice the size on the graph. So I want to make sure that I'm plotting them with consistent scales because I'm really kind of looking for this visual relationship.
Yeah, plotting is always a little bit tricky because the numbers will actually be correct, but you are looking at it and you get this visual difference and you think, okay, well, we got a long ways to go, but in reality the numbers are right there. So always check your plotting, not just in XY plots, but when you're comparing two speed traces or whatever it happens to be. Good habit to get into.
So this is fun because now we've made a math channel where we can, after we've developed a little bit, we have a pretty good idea, can we brake harder or are we pushing the envelope and we need to back up? That's something I do when I'm driver coaching. It's like, let's manage the risk. Don't try braking any harder there, but hey, what if over there you tried X? Anyway, that's how it goes. All right, so we can take this idea and let's expand on it. What if we add a rear theoretical brake pressure. We already have all of our constants. The math is a little different, so make sure that you cut and paste so this all works, because if you mess up a sign, you have that plus instead of minus, or you miss a parenthesis somewhere, your life is hell. You'll go crazy. It's like, why do they not match? But here is the magic math
The
to
rear.
create a rear. And now if I go back to my graph, my plot area, my profile, if you will, and I do some little tricks that there are a lot of, we won't talk about it here. There's in the other webinars, Roger's can explain how to put multiple graphs at one time on your screen.
We're going to put a link. We're going to put a link in the chat box because this is a great spot to put it, and we'll have the link also down in the description box for the YouTube video later. We did a video a while back when we first introduced the whole thought of multiple views, having two XY plots at the same time. You have to set the software up in a special way to do that. I mean, it's very simple to do, but it doesn't come by default. So we did a video. It's there. It is linked in the chat box, or if you're watching this on YouTube later, look down below. It's about a 15 or 20-minute video where it talks about how to set up your software where you can do multiple XY plots.
So when you have multiple XY plots, I can have my front theoretical on this plot and my rear theoretical on this plot. Now I know that they're working because the front should increase, because as I decelerate harder or I brake harder, I get more weight transfer. I know it's load transfer to the front, so that theoretical goes up. And likewise, load is coming off the rear, so we know that it's coming down. So I know I've got a nice shape. These are working well. But now I get to do a fun thing. If I add on my second XY plot the rear brake pressure, I can now see that, oh my goodness, look at how close I am to locking up the front relative to the rear. This really takes that old thing back in the beginning when we were looking at, I'm going to push on the brake pedal and I want to hit 600 pounds and I want the rear to be 420 or whatever. This is a much, much better way of doing this. I can see here that this car, and this is a real live example, was probably much more likely to lock up the fronts than the rear. And it was a fun thing where I was doing a remote data analysis for a fella at the SCCA runoffs, their championships this past year. And before the race, I called him and I said, I think you probably ought to go ahead and dial it more towards the rear, and you can do some better, deceleration if you need to jump somebody in a brake zone or something. Well, afterwards, it was funny. I got a call and he says, you were right. I should have adjusted the brakes.
Not, it worked well. It's I should have, which means he locked up the fronts going into the
he flat spotted it, I think, going down into 5 or whatever. Anyway, but here is a much better way of doing your brake proportioning. And just so everybody has kind of a feel, I always like to have the fronts closer than the rear. Now, you can start kind of working on drivers and cars. Wheelbase makes a big difference. We also have ignored engine braking because that can make a big difference. But it is considered more stable if fronts lock before rears. It's considered unstable if the rears lock before the fronts. So just trying to, always manage safety, always work on the risk. I always like to make sure that my front is closer to my theoretical than my rear, but this was pretty much a no-brainer. And a lot of times when I'm on site, back in the old days when I was actually on teams, I wouldn't even say anything to the driver. Between runs, I go, I'll go in there and click it like 6-8 clicks and then put the sway bar back in the middle. It's just kind of the things I always did, rather than, putting something in drivers' minds, because they can get a little funny that way sometimes. All right. Anyway, this was kind of the thing we were shooting for today. How to get better braking with some data, use the old what if. And you can take this quite a bit further. In my webinars, I go off the deep end here. And this is my personal brake profile, where we've taken that front and rear idea and have actually split it out now to where we have all four corners of the car. And then we even get into more fun things. And rather than just having the theoretical there, if you have suspension sensors, or a lot of people call wheel position sensors, we can add more math channels and start looking at the impacts of bumps. This happens to be a winged car, so we can start to see aero impacts, and there's just really no limit to what you can do with your profile, other than your imagination is limiting that. So,
and one of the things that I think you talk about in your pro classes, your webinars on that previous slide, and I've had a couple of questions on it, so I've kind of held them until we get to that point. Wheel speed sensors and how you tie that all together, because in the end, you're going to need that information to continue to fine tune. You need to know when that braking pressure exceeded the theoretical and did not lock up, or did lock up below it, so you can adjust things. Wheel speed sensors, a big part of what how you're fine tuning this, I suppose, right?
yeah, it's funny what you can do when you start thinking about what if. Um, suspension sensors. I've got a few things I've kept in my back pocket that I've never let out, because you never know, I may have to go back. And I may still have one good run at a championship left in me, but it's going to have to be the right deal. But what if you took your suspension sensors and created a math channel to back out the effective anti-dive in your front suspension? I mean, it's unlimited. I like to use wheel speed sensors to adjust my dampers. I'll look at those and go, oh yeah, run over, click, 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 click. So there's just really no limit. I mean, data, we don't know how lucky we are to have data. Think back in '85. It was amazing.
Before we get to your final, remember the objective part, there is a question here. I knew we were going to be talking a lot about a lot of things, so I didn't get to as many questions as I would like. How about a motorcycle? What do you think about? It's the same concept, right? What do you think about using this on a bike that just has a front and a rear?
You can. You need to adjust the math channels a little bit, because in essence we were splitting out across two contact patches where you only have one contact patch. Okay. So yes, this concept will work for bikes. You just have to kind of tweak it a little bit.
Okay. One other one that was kind of interesting as well, Tice asked, what about and I think somebody else actually asked it as well, ABS, pre-sensor, pre-ABS, post-ABS, as long as you're behind the ABS and you got the line pressure, you should be pretty close with all of your assumptions, right?
Yeah, maybe I should have put that in there as another simplifying assumption. Yeah, no nannies.
Or at least you're behind them, right? You're after them, at least, right?
Yeah, so I'm an old guy. I'm a purist. It's like, turn that stuff off.
I hadn't even thought about this as we were chatting about what we were going to talk about, the ABS side of it. So when I saw the thing, it also, the light bulb went on in my head as well. So perfect. Go ahead and finish up with your remember the objectives. I'll look over the questions a little bit and we'll fine tune those at the end.
The whole thing to kind of wrap this up is, we really got deep into a lot of constants and what those values kind of should be, and the math, and then the concept of using our data system to look at things we never thought about before. But remember, the whole object of the exercise here was I was trying to get a little more area under the curve here on my negative slope. Right. I have to thank Peter Krause so many times for saying this. This is the money line. This is the first thing you need to look at. If I only have one channel, well, it's got to be speed. All the others are luxury. So just remember, we're trying to get more area under the curve. So
it's a good process of always just the process of remembering the objective. I think we often forget that, right? We get so deep into the weeds that we forget to always go back and check in against what is our objective, what are we trying to get at, and continue to fine tune our process. So you coming back to this slide at the end, I think is just is so appropriate, because we often forget this.
All right. There's all of my story.
Perfect,
So,
perfect. Such a valuable way. And again, we're talking all of that. There was just so much information that you mentioned, and then we got into the weeds with a couple of math channels. But really, if you really sit back and you overview this topic and the discussion here today, it's jumping outside the box and just thinking, what if, right? And then coming up with some processes to apply those what ifs and try to understand what the car is doing versus this engineering of the math and the data in the car. Yeah, we talked about a couple of math channels and we threw some constants and we did some things that are pretty cool and people can use, but it's just as much of opening up your mind to the bigger picture of what if. Keep asking that question. Okay. The couple other questions really quickly. If you give us the quick answer of a couple of these, one of these came in early by Bruce, and I don't remember exactly the context of it. But how did you become aware of these different types of sensors early in your career? How were you introduced to all of this hardware? I mean, it really comes back to, in my mind, probably this what if questioning, right? You're sitting there looking at your car or thinking about it, and on Thursday before you get out on the track the first time, and boy, what if I knew that? And then do a little research, you find that there is a sensor for it, and boom, you put it on and you're off and running, I suppose, right? That's how you probably found some of these hardware sensors.
well, some of them was just kind of the evolution of the the nature of this beast. When we got the pole at Indy, immediately everybody's coming through the back door in the garage, and these fellows came through the back door and they said, "Hey, this looks like you guys are really dialed in here. Would you like to put data acquisition on your car?" And I said, "Oh, what is that?" And they said, "Well, we put all these sensors and you can measure everything. It's like the black box on an airplane." And I said, "Oh, hey, that's cool." And they go over and they bring out this thing that looks like a Craftsman toolbox. It's like, uh, there ain't any place you can put that on an Indy car. um, so, that was my first awareness of data. And then, of course, just being an engineer and being around this stuff, immediately, you figure out what Buddy Fay is up to and start reading his books. And, it's just kind of like, you're always aware of what is happening elsewhere in the industry. So it's just kind of evolution, if you will, I guess.
And the inherent inquisitiveness, right, of an engineer trying to make the car faster. It doesn't take long to figure out that you don't know what you don't know, and you need some more information to get that right, and that becomes part of the hardware equation, right? What do I got to do to understand that better? And you grab it. So perfect. One other last thing before we close this down, you did talk about the total number of pistons per side, and you gave a description. You said you look through and you see how many pistons you could actually see. There was wanting a little bit of clarification by Jeffrey, total number of pistons or total number of pistons per side. If you could review that real, fairly quickly again and give a little bit more clarity to that. Say you've got a caliper that has four pistons, two pistons per side, and it's a locked caliber, so the rotor is what's floating. Is that four pistons or is that two pistons?
That would be two pistons.
So it's from one side, and then if it's floating,
Right.
you're gonna have one big one, and it would just be the one, right?
Right.
Okay.
So in essence, it's just the number of pistons on one side of the rotor.
Perfect. That's the way the math is set up to
Yes.
run the math through. So that it's kind of important that you do that. Those of us that run the math channel later. Okay. Perfect. Some of the other questions that I have here are more data analysis. What shape of should the brake pressure graph tell us, or does it tell us? And some other things we'll talk about. We've talked about in some other webinars, and we'll talk about again in the future. So we are running just a tick late, not terrible, but let's go ahead and close this up. And if we see something else pop up, we'll talk about it. This webinar, if you're here live, you're going to see it on within an hour or so. It'll be on our Learn Fast YouTube page, where we put all of our webinars fairly quickly. Make sure you take a look at that. All of the notes, all of the questions and answers, all of that will eventually be in the description for that. If you're watching this now, go ahead and take a look down and hit the view more button there, and you'll see a lot of information about this webinar, including the presentation materials. So make sure you do that. John's always out there supporting his customers, and that's what we do here as well. We're at the track as much as we can be, and a lot of our guys are at the track almost every weekend. So if you don't see them there, give us a call at our tech support line, and we'll do anything we can to help you get the most value out of this hardware and sensors as we can get you. So the John mentioned it a couple of times, and I just wanted to have a slide here that talks about it. What we just went through was just one piece of one of his webinars that he puts on, and he does these weekly webinars. The next one is starting on February 1st. He does those at 5 p.m. Pacific on Monday nights. I think that's the beginner intermediate level, and then he's got an advanced one. I think those are on Tuesday nights, right, John?
Yes.
Perfect. And the same time, and all 5 sessions for just $175. The amount of information that you can get out of what he's going to talk about, what he always talks about during these webinars, is just amazing. And I know in the past, at least, you've always provided all of the materials, a link to a video so you can go back and review it. And of course, you've got his email address, and you can chat back and forth with a few remaining questions, I suppose, as well. So I've never had the opportunity to attend any of these, but I have talked to probably 30 or 40 people in my career when we're out there talking with users, and I've never had a single person give me a bad review. So we have always felt super comfortable, bringing John here and talking about John's webinars, even when we were doing our on-site seminars, and hopefully we'll be doing those again soon. So if you have an interest of learning more about what John just talked about, visit his website, take a look at the webinar Underbar Home page, and new ones are coming here very, very shortly. Here in just 4 or 5 days, he starts the next process, and you'd want to be through all 5 of them, obviously, if you're going to sit down and watch them. So do that if anybody has deeper interest in this. So great tool that John gives us. What's our next webinar? The next webinar a week from today is going to be James Coburn. We're going to very, very popular in the past. James has given us a quick look at learning styles, and just what are learning styles, and how do many racers use those and take a look at them. And what we're going to do next week is we're going to talk about adapting your learning style, jumping in now that you've kind of recognized what works best for you, what's the best way for you to the intake of this information. And James is going to look at it and talk about some examples that he has had when he's got some coaching and some coaching that he does, and then how do we adapt these learning styles for different people. What you don't know what you don't know, right, is kind of the subhead to that. And we're going to talk about that on a week from today, Tuesday, February 2nd. And his first one on learning styles was very, very popular. I got a ton of feedback that people really enjoyed that. It was something a little bit different. And so we're going to take that to the next level. And James, of course, is always a great guy to listen to, very, very knowledgeable, and just such an enthusiast of not only motorsports, but of data. So it'll be fun to listen to. So look forward to that, seeing all of you here for that. So as we kind of close this out, a little bit of contact information for John and I. If there's something that we've that maybe sparked an interest, and maybe you have a little deeper question for it, there's John's contact information, his website, email address, phone number. Give him a holler, and look forward to hearing from you and seeing if there's anything else that we can do. John, thanks again for coming and doing this. Is there anything else you'd like to add as we're kind of closing our way out on this one today?
Just thank you all for inviting me. This was a lot of fun. Hope all you attendees had fun. And remember, race the track, not the other cars.
There you go. One last quote I see in the chat as it goes by. Going to take some time to absorb all of this. Great information. Much appreciated is what Chris is mentioning, and that is some truth to that. And but again, it was as much a bigger picture thing of boy, just putting yourself on that path of asking always, what if I knew that? What value would I have, and what could I do with that? And we're just giving you a couple of tools here on that today. Thanks everybody for coming again. I look forward to seeing everybody on Tuesday. Hope you have a good week, and see you on next Tuesday.